during COVID-19 period, when you were working with Team Novo Nordisk, you published that paper, Use and Perception of Telemedicine in People with Type 1 Diabetes during the COVID-19 pandemic, results of a global survey. I think this was in 2021, sorry. But during that period, during the pandemic, when we think about someone living with type 1 diabetes and all the potential challenges that an athlete living with the condition might face, and then we throw COVID-19 into the mix, where you're traveling between countries is impacted. You're working face-to-face with these athletes, and not to mention that they're a high-risk population as well. I'm thinking about all the other high-profile coaches with different sports clubs or teams across the world and the challenges they went through. But how much of a challenge for you was COVID-19 managing these athletes with type 1 diabetes?
I think, yeah, it's weird to think back on that now. So when I was working there, we were a remote team. So we were already set up to be doing things remotely. The reason for that was because all of the athletes were living in different parts of the world, a lot of them living in Southern Europe. They were all from different places, and then they would tend to travel into the races or a training camp, depending on what their schedule was. It was extremely challenging for everybody, but on the specifics, there could be some riders, especially those in northern Italy, where there was very strict lockdowns, and they weren't allowed to leave their home for like over 100 days. So they were just having to train on a bike trainer all of the time. Don't know if anybody's ever done that, but imagine that your job is to cycle like 5 hours a day just on a stationary bike rather than going outside. So I heard stories that was very, very difficult for the motivation to just do that inside the house all of the time. In terms of like training camp and races and stuff like that, it was just about like discipline, and the team managed it extremely well. Tests beforehand, like these bubbles, kind of restricting people from seeing each other. If there was an outbreak in one group, that bubble was shut down. Everybody was tested, isolated. It wasn't so much fun going to like camps and stuff during that time, because you were having tests multiple times a day. If anybody tested positive, then there was the risk of being stuck in whatever country you were in, like in that hotel room for like 10 days or something like that. But yeah, I mean, it was just work. It was their job. So it was just a case of just get on with it kind of thing. Yeah. It was definitely challenging. Yeah.
What was the telehealth component?
So Sam conducted some research in 2021, and they were looking at, I guess, the perception of telemedicine in people living with type 1 diabetes during the pandemic.
Well, in that project, basically, we were looking at how quickly things had changed in that time, in terms of where people were getting their support from, whether they were able to communicate with their endo, like through video calls or calls, or like this kind of telemedicine approach, and how people were basically adapting. That's what we were looking at, and whether the people who had access to technologies like CGM were able to kind of benefit the most from that. And we were also kind of trying to split down into different people as to understand which demographics were most likely to benefit from that telemedicine approach, and who was kind of struggling the most, which groups were not really getting the help that they needed at that time. I mean, it was just like a survey, and you don't look at the individual responses on that, so you don't get a lot of details. We didn't look further into it on a personal level. But I think since COVID, things have changed a bit in terms of technology is coming on a lot further. Video calls and things, I think people will increasingly look to share their data with their doctor to kind of go through together, understand what's going on, make changes, and those things might change moving forward. I don't know. Drew, maybe you always have your in-person sessions, or are you able to go through data with somebody online? Is that something you feel comfortable with? If they're like your endo, do you find those platforms useful?
Look, I'm going to be honest here. I am not the textbook example of how to have a team approach to diabetes management. I sort of take on the burden myself, and I'm not good at sharing with my doctor. I don't see my endo enough. And I think it's because I feel like I'm educated in this, and I know this is a complete fault, and I'm not saying I don't recommend anyone do this, but I feel like I'm educated in the space. I can interpret my own data. I'm happy to make the changes to my own, insulin regime and all that kind of stuff. And my control is really good. I'm happy with it. Could it be better? Probably, definitely. If I had a multidisciplinary team and had an endo and a diabetes educator and all of these different important people, I reckon my management could be even better. I'm out of the loop in terms of other tech that's up and coming, maybe even other types of insulins that I could benefit from. I know my downside, and that is that I'm happy, managing it on my own, but I should definitely lean on the team more. I actually just wanted to ask you on that note, if you had an athlete, a professional athlete in the Novo team who, you've seen their data, you've seen their CGM data overnight, or maybe you've seen a training block of data around, when they're exercising, in the hours after, and you see maybe a strategy that could be implemented to improve their performance. Do you go straight to the individual with your sort of a grand plan, or do you have to go through the endocrinologist? Do you have to cross-check everything with their doctor? Like, how much control does the athlete give you in terms of, the data, how to read the data, and what changes to make?
Yeah, we had a very kind of open situation with those guys. It was like a team effort. So the person who was most qualified to go to them to present that information, but it was always about that, like when there was something that could be helpful, it was never held back. It was like immediately looked to be implemented. Yeah, there was no problem, but it was always down to the individual themselves to make the decision whether they wanted to take that information on or not. Yeah, and again, I don't have type 1, but I understand your point of view completely. And I think it's really about getting a balance in your life and what you want to do. Like, obsessing over like every single number or perfection or something like that is probably not the right approach, because you have to get a balance of everything else you want to do in your life. You want to focus on other things, and you can't spend your whole life buried in the data. You can't spend your whole life focusing just on that. There's got to be like kind of relief from that. And I think with technologies and things as well, it's good that there's more and more data that's available, but it's got to be like a point where it relieves the pressure on the person living with diabetes. Like, more data isn't always better.
Yes, and I actually would echo that and say that the environment that we're living in now, not just people with diabetes, just the amount of data that we have in general for everybody, is something that you've got to juggle, because you've got these wearable devices like Whoops and Garmin's, and then you've got people wearing CGMs. And then if you have diabetes, you've also got insulin pumps, which has a lot of data, and then the CGM data. Pair that with your Whoop, you've got your heart rate data, you've got heart rate variability, and all of these things. At what point does it become detrimental to be obsessing with these numbers? And at what point, I mean, if you're an elite athlete, I understand the importance of it, but for the general population, that balance between using the data to improve your life and stepping away from the data to improve your life is really where it's a fine line. And I've had trouble with this myself. And I feel like part of the reason why I'm still on multiple daily injections and I'm not on a pump is because I just don't want to have another device attached to me that's just sending me numbers and tracking data all the time. And I feel like a sense of freedom not having a pump attached to me. Did your athletes in the Novo Nordisk team wear a pump, or were there multiple daily injections? What was the sort of blend?
So within the team, this would be something that would surprise people, because people would say, oh, theoretically you could have better management with a pump or something like that. But the personal choice is so important. So with the more, like, I would say, I don't want to say older or more experienced athletes, the ones who are kind of in their late 20s, early 30s, they were all using MDI. So they were all using injections when I got there. And when you speak to them, there was a variety of different reasons behind that. Either they'd had a bad experience with the pump previously, in terms of like tubing, or they'd had a pump failure. These guys are traveling all over the world, and the last thing you want is to be completely in a foreign country and your pump fails and you don't have a backup. So they found that they were having to take their injections with them anyway, just in case something like that happened. If they have a crash, the damage that kind of happens if you've got a pump as well, the feeling of being like attached to something, and the feeling of having something, I think that you can't make that decision for somebody else. You can't like kind of say, oh, it could be better if you use this, because you have to understand, like, how is that person going to feel having a device that's attached to their body. Like it's much more than just a simple decision of, am I going to have a straight glucose line, if that's what you're aiming for. You've got all of these other social reasons, all of these other personal reasons that you have to take into account. The other thing as well is that they had found something that worked for them. They work on routine. Maybe this is how you are as well. You've kind of got to a point where you're happy with the way that it works. You know what you're doing in different situations, and that's good. That's good. And you don't want to kind of go through a situation of changing everything up, relearning everything. You're kind of good for now. However, I was seeing as well that the really young guys, so the guys who are like 17, 18 years old, they were doing all kinds of things. They were mostly on pumps. They were doing different things like looping and using different systems, like these automated insulin device delivery systems, where they have kind of feedback between their CGM and their insulin pump. It's personal choice. It depends. The younger guys were in a situation where they were really open to experimenting. They were aiming to enter the team. They were looking to like kind of learn and do those things. The older guys had got their kind of strategy down. And I think that, it's personal choice.
Yeah. I've seen that in the diabetes community, just in general. The longer you've had diabetes, the older you are, you seem to sort of stick to your ways of MDI. I even know people who are still using syringes, like literally like drawing the insulin out. But the younger demographic, I mean, they're a generation of technology. They've grown up with tech. They've grown up with the latest iPhone, and they find the closed loop systems to be incredible. I mean, the algorithms are unbelievable. I've got a couple of young kids I work with. They're 13 years old. They're pretty good athletes, and they have those closed loop systems, and their control is unbelievable. The time in range is like 98%. They barely have any sort of like major fluctuations in extreme high or extreme low. It's just this nice tight control. And I can see the utility for somebody who is used to tech and doesn't really care about having that data overload. I mean, the management is unbelievable compared to MDI, which it can be harder to manage. Once you give that dose, it's in your system. There's no taking that back. Whilst with the pump, you're getting this drip feeding dose, and it's a very different experience.